This demonstration is to show you how to copy a tailored jacket. I've chosen a man's jacket with a check. The check helps you understand the direction of the grain for each part of the garment. I'm looking through my garment first to see if there is any darts under the collar. This one doesn't have a dart, which will make it a bit easier to copy. And seeing if there's any other things that are unusual about my jacket and the panels before I start. This is a classic double vented man's jacket, and the undercollar has been done with Melton felt. So because our undercollar isn't actually a pattern piece, is that we need to check the position of where the collar ends. I do this by putting some pins through the edge where the lining meets the collar, because when we copy the collar we'll be using the inside of the collar. So we can see on this jacket it's quite different. You don't always get the same result, so you must always check. Sometimes the pins come through directly on the edge of the Melton, and sometimes they come through further away. So in this respect, I actually think that the position of where the Melton is ending is the more attractive line. So I'm going to mark on the inside the position where I would want my collar pattern to finish. So I'm now ready to start copying the front of the jacket. I'm laying the jacket out onto the paper. I will be looking to see how much of the jacket can lay flat. I've got my stripe in my fabric, so I can actually see that this jacket starts to cut away slightly from the button, the first button from the collar break. I've got my paper laid onto the card, masking taped to the desk so that I can be nice and secure with my pins. This doesn't protect your table from being scratched. It's purely to help us secure the pins so that we only have to push the pin in and our paper is less likely to tear. I'm just marking with the draping tape where the dart is, just to make it more visible for the demonstration. You wouldn't need to do this because you would be able to see your dart easily. Okay, so I've managed to lay my jacket flat through the main part of the body to the mid-front chest. And from this area, I can't get this to lay flat while the lower part is pinned down, so that I'll copy this first. Just drawing around the outside edge. Drawing into the buttonholes. I'm going to use my awl to go through the dart position because the fabric is quite thick and I don't think I'll get sufficient information from the tracing wheel. So I'm pushing through because it's a straight line. I'm making a mark about every centimetre. I'm also going to mark the position of the pocket. And I think I'm going to use my awl on the side seam as well because this is quite thick. Again, every centimetre because it's a straight line. I'm marking the position of the pocket going past the seam so that when I'm checking the two pieces, once the pattern is completed, I can judge that they've come back together in the same place. Now I will be able to see the amount that's gone into the dart. You can check through the stripes how much is missing. We can see that it's a very small amount. The width of the stripe before the dart is about 2.8, and in the centre of the dart it's about 1.5. So we can see that there's only 1.3 centimetres in the dart. When I allow the jacket to move over to its relaxed position, the opposite side of the dart, is that it will probably not open the full 1.3 centimetres. So I will have to make a little adjustment afterwards because I can tell from my additional information from the stripes that I know how much should be in that dart. So to allow the dart to move, I'm anchoring at either end of the dart. The dart would have finished just below the pocket. I am going to mark the side seam in its existing position so that I will be able to judge whether it did move over 1.5 centimetres or whether I need to add a little extra. So you can see I've only left pins in that are the side seam side of the dart. I can tell from my front line position that it's moved over about 1 centimetre, so I know that I will have to add a little extra when I go through my pattern at the final stage. I'm just anchoring that into position. And then we shall mark through the side seam up to the armhole about every centimetre again because it's a straight line. Okay, so we've marked up to the underarm position. We now need to re-secure the upper area. We can undo the lower pins And we make sure that we're lining back up with our armhole and coming in back to the original line of the lapel. So I'm putting the pins in, and we'll anchor across the front chest. I'm going to mark through for the lower part of the armhole using the awl because it's quite thick, and because it's a curve I will be marking every 5 millimeters. I'll just pin those out of the way. I carry on marking past the side seam for the armhole of the next pattern piece, so that when I bring the pattern pieces together I can check and see that the armhole shape is continuing correctly. I can now undo the lower pins because I have my anchor row across the chest, and then I will try and flatten out the upper part of the jacket. I'm going to push the sleeve inside so that it's not in the way. And I'm going to secure the upper area. See that my stripe is waving slightly, so I'm trying to straighten it out so I'm not distorting my fabric. I'm going to work on the collar side of the shoulder first. I'm going to use the awl because it's thick and bulky. And I'm pushing through the zigzag finish on the Melton undercollar. I'm drawing in my collar. I draw the angle of how the top collar meets with the lower lapel, just so that I can know that I've got the exact position of connection. I'm now going to undo the lapel edge, which will help me be able to push the sleeve side of the shoulder down. I'm just pushing the rest of the jacket out of the way so you can see more easily. But normally when you were copying this you would be fine with your hand inside and then following with the awl, making sure that the stripes are staying straight, and then pushing in into the seam line, up through the shoulder to the edge. Luckily the shoulder pad on this jacket wasn't too thick, and I think I've been able to get through it. But if it had been too thick to be able to get the awl through for the corner, if I've got the markings coming through the armhole and across the shoulder to as far as I can get, then I would have to make an estimation of where the two would cross and take a shoulder measurement as an additional reference, and then try it out on a toile. As I've copied the left hand side of the jacket, I am going to mark the pocket position, because it's useful to know where it was on the original. Now, as this area around the neck and shoulder is quite bulky, we've got to take care when we're taking the pins out and marking to see if all of the marks have come through or whether we need additional information. Now I can see that the connection between the inside neck and the shoulder, there's no marks there, so I need to make sure I can place this back into its correct position, pin it back down and mark the shoulder going across to the neck edge. Drawing around the marks left. We can see that we gained 11 millimeters, but we know that it was 1.3 that was needed, so at the waist position we need to add a little extra to the outside edge. Double checking that the centre of the dart at its slimmest position was adjacent to the central buttonhole. So we're looking about this area here. So we've got the waist information, and we'll come back to how the dart works within the jacket and is affected through the pocket slit at a later stage when we've got more pattern pieces. You can see that the lines themselves are a bit wavy, so we need to straighten them up. We don't add any seam allowances on until we have other pattern pieces to check against. So now we're going to do the back panel of the jacket. We can lay the lower part flat, but we can't lay the upper body flat at the same time. So we're going to put our anchor pins in and then copy the lower part of the jacket. We're using the check of our fabric as a guide to try and make sure that we're not distorting the garment as we're pinning it down. Because the centre back seam isn't so thick, we can use the tracing wheel. And I'm also going to wheel down one of the single thread stripes to give myself the grain line and go acrossways as well to indicate any distortions. I'm going to draw around the visible edges. So it's the hem. I can wheel through the side seam, and I'm feeling for where the vent starts, and I'm marking crossways so that I've got that position. I'm then going to undo the lower pins and pin as far as I can while the jacket's still flat. And checking to make sure that my tracing wheel markers came through the fabric. I'm pushing the shoulder in onto itself so that the back armhole can lay flat onto the desk. And I'm going to wheel a little further up. Okay, now there's a section here where the side panel, the back and the sleeve all interconnect. So we want to make sure that we've got a record of exactly where that happened. So I'm going in with the bradawl and I'm marking into the jacket about 1 centimetre and then doing a row of dots just a few millimetres apart, and that will let me know that that was the point where the 3 connected. I'm also going through the very end of the back panel to where that point meets and going through the armhole quite closely, only a few millimetres apart, because this is an important area and we need to make sure that we're accurate. Okay, so continuing up the back armhole, we need to flatten the area. We can release the lower part and we are flattening the area of the central back coming into the armhole. I'm pushing the shoulder pad and the shoulder around to try and get this area as flat as possible. I'm marking with the bradawl about every 5 millimetres because it's a curve. And then I'm doing the lower anchor pins. And securing further up the jacket. So we're now securing the back neck and shoulder. Always trying to make sure that we're keeping our stripes as straight as possible. Marking through the back armhole again, 5 millimetres apart. Holding the sleeve head down to keep the shoulder pad flat as much as possible. I'm then marking up the shoulder line, allowing the jacket to move around so the shoulder at the neck edge can lay flat, and marking again. So just holding the lift of the collar so that the back neck can lay flat, and again I'm marking through the top of the zigzag stitch to the centre back. I'm just going to lift my jacket and make sure that I've got markings for the upper centre back. And there I can see that I've marked my back seam in all the way, and start to take my pins out and lift a stage at a time to make sure that my information has come through before lifting the whole jacket off. And that all appears fine, so I can remove the jacket. I'll then go over the dotted lines with my pencil. I'm going to mark in the line that I took from this stripe, because this will be my grain line. And just double checking that it was at right angles. It was very slightly distorted by a couple of millimetres, so I will need to just bear that in mind if I think there's adjustments that need to be done later to the grain. I'm straightening up the shoulder seam. There is a very slight little curve upwards for the inner neck. I'm going to leave it there because we do get this on some jackets if the collar sits high. Now we can see that we have our marker where the intersection point is, so we know the exact finish. I can see that the centre back seam doesn't finish at right angles and straight. Is that I'm going to make mine straight because that's probably just distortion over time. So the back panel is now ready until we have more pieces to check it against. I'm now copying the side panel. So you pin through the waist area first. This gives you a starting position. And then we're going to get the lower part to lay flat, taking care that we're not distorting the stripes. Using stripes and checks when you're first learning how to copy garments is really useful. Okay, that's pretty flat. A little wave there. I'm just trying to smooth out a bit more. Okay, so we can now copy the lower section of the side panel. Because the seams aren't too thick, we can go through with the tracing wheel. Again, we're going to mark the pocket. also going to mark the angle of the vent. And mark crossways so that we've got the position of where the vent finishes. So I'm going to put in another row of pins above the waist so that I'll have 2 rows before I undo the lower section. The area is less likely to distort if we have at least 2 rows. We've now got to make sure that we're keeping the underarm as close to its original shape as possible without distorting it. The stripes again are very useful in this position because we can follow the stripes going upwards, and then again the stripes going across because we have a check, to make sure that we're not distorting the connection points at the back armhole. So I'm going to wheel up to close to the armhole area. Okay, so this area here, you've got to be careful that you don't distort it by allowing it to drag backwards. You can see that if you didn't have the stripe, you could easily make that mistake. So in the early stages of learning how to copy garments, I do strongly recommend using stripes and checks, because you can actually keep track of where the original piece should sit and make sure that you're not pulling it in the wrong direction. So I'm going to do this area with the awl, coming around every 5 millimeters and going past the seam line to continue the curve so that I've got a record of when I'm putting my pattern pieces together. Now, because this point here is quite sharp and fine, I'm going to go over it again because I'll want my dots and my indentations to be closer together so that I know that it's more accurate. Take that pin out to get in. And then also at the very end, I'm going to do the same as I did on the body part, and I'm going to do a row of indentations for about 1 centimetre, a few millimetres apart, so that I've got the very end of the point marked on the pattern. I'm just going to secure the front armhole. Now I'm just going to lift the edges and check before I lift the whole pattern piece. So I'll roll it back carefully, and I can see that I've got my armhole and my side seam. And then for the other part, the most important point, I need to know it's nice and clear and that I have the end position marked. Yeah, so that's all fine. Yeah, there's marks going all the way around, so that I can now remove the garment from the paper. So we just need to go over the tracing wheel and all marker lines with our pencil. Just checking that the lines are smooth because we don't want any wiggly lines. that's just ready to check into the other pattern pieces. We're going to go through our body pattern first to check that everything fits before we do our sleeve. I'm going to remove excess paper, but making sure that I leave enough for hems to be added in to my pattern pieces. On our back panel, we need to make sure that we are leaving enough fabric for the vent that needs to fold back. Right, we just need to check through our pattern pieces to double check that they join together. You must always check your patterns. Don't assume because you copied it from the same pattern piece that you haven't made any mistakes. I can use my pocket position as a starting point. It will work in the same way as a balance notch will. So I'm starting from the pocket position going downwards to the hem. I can see my pattern matches. And then again, I'm going from the pocket position up to the armhole, and my pattern piece matches. If there had been any slight discrepancies, I would have just smoothed it up into a nice shape. If it had been more than about 3 or 4 millimeters, I would measure the side seam of the sample and check and see if I'd done one of them wrong, and I may have to recopy a piece. We'll actually put a balance notch in because I like a balance notch to be fairly close to the armhole, so I know that I would be correct for my curves. On the back position, we've got 2 points that we can use as a guide. We've got the marker that we made for the absolute ends where the intersection is of these 2 pieces in the sleeve. And then we've got the marker of where the vent would finish. This isn't always quite so accurate. There might be a few millimeters discrepancy, but never a great deal. So I'm going to start at the position at the armhole and work my way down, seam edge to seam edge, and just to mark that I can see that there is a few millimeters discrepancy, and then when I swing it from that position I can see that the 2 hems match. So I'm actually going to go to the higher one because it would be easier to lower it if necessary than it would be to add on. I'm then going to look at my jacket and see how much hem allowance there was for the vent. You can see at the top of the vent there was 4.5, and at the hem it says 4.4, so it would have been 4.5 all the way down. I will then mark 4.5 for the depth of the vent. Now when I'm lining the 2 up, I'm finding that there's a few millimeters, about 4 millimeters discrepancy. So this will either mean that the angle at the bottom is too wide or the waist is too narrow at the top. Now when I'm looking at this shape, it did wave outwards, so it may well be that that should have been a little straighter. And then I'm drawing on the back of the pencil line, which will transfer onto the other piece so that my two angles are the same. I need to check the shoulders. Now on a tailored jacket, the back shoulder should be about 3 millimeters bigger than the front, because there's a small amount of ease in the back shoulder that's allowing for the roundness of the shoulder blade. So I'm going to draw 2 balance notches. I'm going to work from the inside edge and mark, and from the outside edge and mark, and then look to see if there's any extra, and I've got about 2 or 3 millimeters, so I'm quite happy with that. That should be okay. So we've checked that our body pieces go together, and the next thing we need to do is to look at the dart position. Okay, so we're now going to finish off the dart area of our front panel. I'm going to draw in the lower part of the pocket, because we need to cut into this area. I'm just going to make a gentle line for the upper part, because it's the area in between where I'm going to make the cut. So I'm cutting in just past, if my pocket finishes at 1.5 past my dart, I'm just going to cut in about 5 millimeters past my dart line. My dart from the central waist type area is only 1.3 centimeters. It falls straight from that position. I'm then going to close my dart. So I'm folding on the line closest to the centre front and folding it over. Now I only actually need to fold over the area where the dart is equal, because the upper area cannot be folded at the same time, because it will change direction, and it can do that in fabric because it's soft, but it wouldn't be able to do it easily in paper without tearing. And what I'm looking for is where these two areas cross. So I will need to remove the area of overlap to the dart position. Now I'll trim that away. You can also see that when I've closed the dart, is that to match it up to the lower body position, I need to add on to the side. So this will need to be smoothed in back into the side body to accommodate the amount that's been taken out for the dart. I'll now need to double check my side panel. So I'm working from the top of the body. I'll be marking where the top part of the slice finishes. We will have an opening for the width of the pocket. So I'm just going to check and see. So I'm marking for the bottom part. And the direction for the pocket has changed very slightly. Just moved down a couple of millimetres, which I think is acceptable because we're going to make a toile and we'll be able to see exactly where we want our pocket then. But we know now that the two match when they're put together. So the next part that we're going to do is the sleeve. Now I must stress the importance of making sure that you're always using information from the same side of the jacket. Don't assume that your jacket is completely symmetrical. There may have been mistakes made in the cutting or the sewing, and your armhole circumference may be slightly different from one side to the other. So we must always make sure that we use the front side and back from the same side of the jacket and the sleeve that corresponds to it to get the most cohesive information. So now we're going to do our sleeve. You can see that it's very difficult to get a sleeve to lay flat. So things to do first to try and help us kind of stabilise the information is if we roll our sleeve at the seam, at the front arm seam, and we're going to just pin through both sides of the fabric to try and keep a record of our sleeve pressed flat. Now we're only able to do this as far as the bottom of the armhole. Once the sleeve starts to bend around the armhole itself, so the sleeve head, is that we're not able to pin through that area and keep it flat. The reason that we're pinning through is so that we can keep a record of we have a seam along this edge, and the back armhole seam is in this position, and so that we can keep track of the distances from the fold. Now this sleeve has got quite a bend on it, but we know that this is a fold, so it must eventually line up to a straight line. We can see in this area here that that's about the straightest position. So when we draw the line on our paper and line our sleeve up to it, is that this is the area that will be touching our pencil line. The sleeve is probably the most difficult area of the jacket to copy. My line is up in this position, and I'm putting my anchor pins in through the cardboard, using the lines of the stripe to try and stay as straight as possible. Alright, so we're okay to now draw around this area. Now we need to firmly push the sleeve head down and anchor it with pins as much as possible. You can see that we come to areas that's really difficult to lay flat because there's ease in the sleeve head that's made it roll. It's become three-dimensional. So what we can do is that we can pin it down as closely as we can, and then we can pin out the area that's lifting, and that will let us know how much extra to add on to the curved edge. So I'm pinning the shoulder down to try and keep it flat. So you can see that we're now able to have that in a much more controlled shape. Now this is very, very thick, and I'm going to have to push through quite hard with my awl. Again, every 5mm, because we're on a curve. I'm still having to push it down with my hand. Now, through this last part here, it's way too thick for me to be able to get through. So I'm marking with my pencil the final end, and I've been able to mark with my awl up to almost the front shoulder position. So I can see that that continues in a line from that position, and we'll need to make an estimation. You can also see that the head doesn't come back up to the line. Now the distance between the sleeve that we can see and the central line is usually the amount of ease that's gone into the head, because that's been pulled around the curve of the armhole, so it can no longer lay straight. We now come to our underarm, of which we need to lift the jacket upwards so that we're not pushing the armhole to curve downwards. We can check with our lines to see if we're staying true to the fabric. And then we can push into this area and get the lower part of the armhole. Right, so I will then be undoing these pins and checking that my markings came through before I release the sleeve. Okay, so I can see that my markings came through, and I was able to mark to the just before the shoulder line position, and you can see that my pencil line, it would just naturally follow. So it doesn't really matter that I've not been able to get through the shoulder pad, because I had enough information. Now it would have been useful to have a marker where the sleeve head had met the shoulder seam. So I'm going to roll the jacket back onto the paper so that I can mark in the shoulder position as it touches the sleeve head. So I'm taking care that I'm following the line, and so for about 1 centimetre into the seam line, I'm pushing in to make a few marks, and that lets me see that that's the position where the sleeve meets the shoulder. There will be a slight adjustment when we're working on our sleeve because the ease is all over this side. It's all pushed into the centre at the moment, where it would be gradually around the sleeve, so there will be a small change here. I'm going to take this side off the paper and then lift it and do the other side of this top sleeve. Right, so that we can make sure that when we're doing the other side of the top sleeve that we've stayed in the correct position, if we square off from the centre line to the armhole and draw the line across, we can then make sure that when we're pinning our sleeve on to get the other side, that we are balanced and in the correct position. Now the area that I'm trying to lay flat will not be the whole area of the sleeve. It's just the additional part of the top sleeve that was the other side of the fold. So I'm going to need to work in sections and try and bend it back around, following the existing line from the opposite side, from the front side. So I can do this section, that's the central part where we started off, and then I'm going to work upwards, and I can get this fairly flat and bending slightly over the central line. And I can see from the stripe on my sleeve that that's the correct thing to do. So I'm going to mark further up, and I'll need to do the armhole with the awl. Again, I start marking the armhole about 1 centimetre away from where the seam connects, so that I can follow the shape more evenly. I'm pushing quite hard, and that's about as far in as I can get through the thickness of the pad. And I'm drawing the line. Followed, I'm also at the position at the very end of the point. I'm going to go across at right angles to that connection for 1 centimetre, marking every few millimetres, so I've got a record of the exact corner. So I can take these pins out so that that can release, and then I can be working on the lower part of the armhole and pushing the edge to the point where it's touching the line created when we were doing the front side of the top sleeve. And I can go through this area with the wheel because it's not very big. I can then undo these 2 pins because I won't be able to get this to continue around if the connection is too long. But I need to have at least 2 sets of pins to know that I'm secure. So I'm then bending this further. Now I can see that I'm not able to bend this all the way around. So I can see there's a little part here that's lifting, so I'm going to put a pin in. If there's anything that you can't get to lay flat because of the shaping, if you pin out that area, you can then come back afterwards and correct it. So I can only get it to lay flat to about there. So I'm going to anchor with pins either side of that. Mark with the tracing wheel for the area I managed to get to. I can then undo the anchor pins further up. I can then look to see if the sleeve will bend any further down, and it won't. It's only lining up with the central line. Is that if I pull it any further round, I will be distorting the fabric. So I'm going to mark it in that position. And I also need to mark the position of where it finished. Okay, so now I'm just going to lift the sleeve a little to make sure I've got information all the way through the sleeve. I need to put a little marker at the position where I've taken the little extra amount of fabric out. So I'm going to just put a pencil line over my information and then get ready for the next stage. Okay, so I'm going to measure to see how much we pinned out. I'm measuring from the pin to the fold is about 3.5, possibly 4 millimeters, which means that I need to cut into this position where the pins had been and open that 7 to 8 millimeters and see how much the lower part will then close. So, just cutting around my paper, leaving enough space to be able to put a hem. I'm going to cut into the line, and I'm not just going to the fold line, I'm going to the line created by the shape when we were doing the front sleeve. So I'm going to cut to that position, and then I need to put along, coming very close to the same position, but I'm going to try and still leave a tiny bit of paper connected so that I can just close it. And so if I measure how much it opened 7 millimeters. So we were able to completely close the bottom of the sleeve, and we're starting to create the curve of the armhole. I'm going to add a piece of paper into the back of that opening and sellotape it down. So just to make it more visible, I will just... So this small amount pinned here on the back seam of the top sleeve has been opened on the pattern to create 7 millimeters, and that's allowed the gap to close. We can see that these two pieces aren't matching exactly, and I will come back to that at a later stage. We now need to look at the head of the sleeve. There was an amount that would have been sleeve, that the roll, the ease on the head, that we needed to pin out because we couldn't get it to lay flat. Now I need to measure how deep that is in its central position of the excess, and that is about 8 millimeters. So I know that for that I'm lining up to the marker that was the shoulder, finding the deepest part of the pinned out area, which is approximately here. And I can tell that I need to come out at that position 1.6. So I need to add that on here, coming back to nothing and rolling back into the head. So I'm just following the line from the back sleeve, coming around and then coming back into nothing. So we can actually only create a good estimation of our sleeve. It's very difficult to copy the sleeve exactly while it's still connected to the jacket. But we can iron out any discrepancies in the toile. So when we make our toile, the first time we only cut one sleeve and make any adjustments before we go ahead with the rest of our jacket. So I'm just going to take out the unnecessary pins, leaving the main part of the sleeve still pinned together to keep it nice and flat. Just need to pop that pin back in. And then we can work on the undersleeve. Okay, we're now going to look at doing the undersleeve. We don't need to leave the pinning there because we want the undersleeve to just lay flat. And we can see it is bobbling slightly, but once we get it sort of anchored nice and flat onto the paper, we should be able to find it more manageable. So I'm choosing a section through the mid part of the sleeve, and I'm using the stripe to try and keep the pattern piece straight without too much distortion. You can see I've got a bit of a bump there that I can't flatten out, so I'm going to need to undo the pins on the other side. Now it's important that we try to keep the curve of the under sleeve to the armhole to correspond to the sleeve shape as much as possible and not be distorted by the armhole shape. So I'm going to, in a couple of positions, pin out the excess on the body to allow the armhole curve to round smoothly. You need to do this in a few positions because if you try and take too much out in one position, you will distort the curve. You will not get a smooth line, you'll get a corner. So we've still got a little bit of bubbling, and this jacket has probably had a small amount of ease in the underarm. This can be a personal choice of the tailor. If you're after a roomier sleeve, then you would put some ease in under the arm. If you're after a slim sleeve, then you wouldn't. If you're doing a made to measure for somebody that has particularly muscular arms, you will probably find that you need to add ease in under the arm as well as on top of the arm to allow for the bulge of the muscle. So I'm looking at the amount that won't lay flat, and I'm putting a little pin in it so I can keep a record of it. I will come back to this when I'm checking whether my sleeve fits my armhole to decide whether I need to slash down and open the underarm to allow for this extra, or whether it was ease and I don't particularly want it on the underarm of my jacket. So I've got a nice smooth line. I'm now coming in with my awl, and I'm poking the awl into the ditch of the stitching every 5 millimeters because we're going round a curve. I continue for about 1 centimetre past the end of the seam line, so that when I'm connecting my pieces I can tell if the line is flowing. There's a seam from the body, from the side body, meeting our undersleeve, so I'm going to, at right angles, do like a little notch and do several holes a few millimeters apart, so that I've got a record of where that seam was matching on my sleeve, so that when I'm putting the pieces back together at the end, and if I have any problems, I can tell exactly which area is fitting and which area needs adjustment. I'm checking at the very edge to see if I am on the seam line, because sometimes it's rolled slightly, and this jacket has remained on the seam edge, so I can just draw that line. So I'm just going to undo a few pins to make sure that my markers have come through, and I've got the dots of the armhole and the seam line coming upwards, but the last little bit is missing, so I'm just going to roll that back in and push through the end part again. And a little marker for where it finished. The area at the very end of the sleeve. So we can then unpin our sleeve, just checking as we roll it down that we've got all our information. I'm just looking to see where the grain line was, and it would have been helpful if I'd have marked that when I had things pinned down. So I'm just lining that back up, just pop a few pins in to secure it. So when you're working on your garment, if there's anything that you've missed, just go back in and put the information there. I'm following the stripe as a guide. So you can see on this sleeve that the grain line is not at right angles to the hem. So we're going to check that the undersleeve and top sleeve match each other. So the easiest part of the sleeve is the underseam, so that seam is most likely to be correct. So we check that one first. So stitch line on top of stitch line. Yeah, and they pretty much, they match. The line will come round smoothly. Now, the back seam of the sleeve is the more difficult because there's going to be ease in it, and there's also shaping, so we need to just check and see what the results are. So I'm starting at the top and I'm just working my way down, stitch line on top of stitch line, and we find that our back sleeve is about 6 millimeters longer than our undersleeve, so that would account for the ease. So we'll create some notches, and this is the centre of the underarm, and that's where your elbow will be. So the ease needs to go over the elbow towards the upper sleeve. So I'm just going to mark that. So I've checked between the notches, and we have 5 to 6 millimeters of ease, which I now know that the back seam of the sleeve, the length is okay. I'm now going to check the head shape. So I can now work from the upper notch to the head of the sleeve, and I draw through what I can see from the underneath seam to make sure that I'm getting a really nice smooth line. And I'm able to continue with the original line that I had. That's not always the case. Sometimes you may find that there's a slight discrepancy and that you would want to make an adjustment here. So then working to the bottom of the sleeve, matching the two notches, we can see that we have the step that we weren't sure what to do with. But we do know that the two underneath seams, the underseam, match each other. So if we run a line through there, we can follow the new line, making sure that that information is also added to our undersleeve. Now, not all garments have a properly balanced sleeve, and at this stage we can't tell completely whether our sleeve is balanced or not. So we can either toile it and check it on our main body. There is another way. We can line up from the grain line to the underarm and line that line up with the line that we created when we were copying the top sleeve. When we connect from this position, we can see that there's a very slight discrepancy of about 5 millimeters. Now, if any of these circumstances happen, just draw a new sleeve head, because you're going to check it on your toile, and it's always better if something is slightly bigger than too small, because you can take the excess away. It's far easier than needing to add more fabric in. So I am actually going to raise that position, and if I can start with my sleeve being correctly balanced, then any adjustments that I make later will be more accurate. I don't have a problem extending this line slightly because it's now grown by about 4 millimeters, and we had that very small amount underneath the arm that we pinned out, that we could see was slightly bigger than the armhole itself. I'm going to put a notch here high up on the sleeve, because if I'm sewing and I've matched at this position, is that I'm highly unlikely to ever make a mistake in the last couple of centimetres before I got to the end. So this adjustment has changed my balance notch for the ease slightly. So I'm checking down the back sleeve to see how much ease I have. And my ease is reduced. I've now only got about 2 millimeters of ease. So I'm going to need to slightly shorten the back armhole again. So it's probably going to go back to the original line. I'm just going to check that. Yeah, it's brought me back to the original line. So you must always check your work, and any area where you've made an adjustment, you must check through the whole seam again to see what effect it's had on every other notch along that seam, to make sure that you are staying balanced and correct. Just going to look at the underarm. So I'm now joining up my underarm seam of my sleeve, and I'm drawing in the curve of the adjoining undersleeve. We can see that we're ending at a corner, and that's just not good enough, because that will be really awkward to sew and it wouldn't sit properly. So we need to round that curve off. So I'm just curving that shape, and I'll make sure that the information is on both pattern pieces. Line stuck to the curve and drawing the line in. It would also be useful to have a notch high up on the inside arm. So we now know that we have a smooth and balanced sleeve head, and we have ease on our top sleeve going to our undersleeve across the centre back of the arm seam, and that our cuffs are balanced. Okay, we're now going to do the collar of the jacket. We can't always guarantee that our jacket has been made completely correctly and is symmetrical. When I've looked at the inside collar, I can see that there's quite a large discrepancy between the collar stands. I just pop a pin in each side to let you see the difference. We can see that our collar stands, one side is about 1.3 to 1.5 centimetres, and the other side is only about 7 to 8 millimetres. So the jacket itself, the lining, it may just be the position of where the lining's been put in, but we can't get absolutely accurate information about our collar. The fact that it's a Melton collar at the back is that we'll just check that that is even. We'll fold it in half, bring our edges together and push a pin through the point. No, it won't go through that side. Yeah, and the reason it won't go through is because it actually is meeting the thickest part in the corner on the other side. So the outer garment is actually okay. So it's probably just the way that the lining's been put in but it makes it more difficult for us to see our information. We can see here that the line isn't smooth, that it's waved, and this one is too narrow. This one's actually come inwards. So it's difficult when you're learning, but once you have a bit more experience, you can make an assessment about it. Is that we know that this one is too thin and it would never be that shape, that this is the more accurate. Luckily, this is the side that we've been copying from. So I'm going to push in some pins through the zigzag to find the same position that I marked for the body, to make sure I'm following the same position for the collar. So we can see that the end of the collar stand should have finished at about 1 centimetre, and then would gradually come through into an area of 1.5. Now the collar, due to the fact that it has a melton underneath, is that there's a certain amount of collar roll that's been affected. So we're going to need to pin that out to be able to get the collar to lay flat. We would know that what we were pinning out to get the collar to lay flat, we can just add back on to the top edge, because it's the collar roll. It's the excess on the top collar that's allowing the collar to sit nicely, and that your seam at the edge of your collar is rolled underneath and is not visible when you're wearing the garment. So you can see that more needs to be removed at the back than it does towards the front of the back collar. So, and that's due to the fact that there's more height. When the collar is rolling, it's got more height at the back of the collar, and as it comes towards the front it lays flat. So it doesn't need quite so much excess. Okay, so I can now get the collar to lay flat. We have the advantage of the stripes, which I can use as a visual aid to make sure that I'm not distorting the collar. And then I'm going to pin the collar down and trace the upper collar. You can see that the upper collar bends in this direction, and the collar stand bends in the opposite direction, or on occasions is just completely straight with a little curve on the bottom. So they're pointing in opposite directions, and that's what gives you the neatness of the collar being able to come in close to the neck and then lay smoothly without wrinkles at the edge. You can see I'm positioning my collar so that my stripes stay straight. Once you have more understanding of how to copy a garment, you wouldn't find it so much of a problem to copy a plain fabric. I would just always recommend a stripe or a check for when you are first learning, so that you can have a greater understanding of distortion and grain lines. Just going over the corners again to make sure that I have them. I'm marking an approximate centre back. We have a seam in the lining and it does line up with the central position on one of the checks. So I'm just going to mark that in, but I wouldn't know yet whether it was absolutely correct. But there's a good possibility, because when we look at the positions of the stripes, we can see that the amounts at the end are only slightly different. If I measure how much has been pinned away, it's 2.5 millimeters, which would mean it's 5 millimeters. And so that amount would need adding on, coming back to nothing. And now I've made that alteration on this side because this side of the collar is corresponding to the left front, and this was the side that we copied, so it's most likely to fit into the jacket pattern that we've created. Now the connection where this stand meets the front facing is going to be about 1 centimetre, maybe 1.2. So I am going to take these pins out because they're a little dangerous. I already know that that line where the collar stand and the lining isn't correct, so I'll be using the seam line that connects to the collar itself to gain my information from. I can see from the stripes that are on the stand, I can manipulate it back into its original curve. And I'm marking in with the awl. I'm marking the collar line quite a ways past, at least sort of 2 or 3 centimetres past the end of the seam, so that I've got a record of the line that the stand needed to allow the collar to follow. Now I'm going to mark through the back. We're going to undo the collar. So I'm taking the pins out and I'm penciling line and the depth at the back. If the collar itself had been manufactured more accurately, I would have been able to draw in the rest of the collar, but as it is, I know from my information from the front collar that it finished to about 1 centimetre, 1.2 towards the front, and so I've got the depth that it would be at the back, and so then it would just become a gentle curve following that line, and I will make it symmetrical. And then when I'm doing the final check of the collar going into the neck of the jacket, I will be able to improve this pattern piece if it doesn't fit correctly. Just going to sharpen up the end of the collar. And then I'm going to cut them out and fold them over and and check how symmetrical they are. Okay, I tend to hold my collar up to the light and match up the points here and here. On this particular pattern, they match accurately, which is a good sign. I always copy a whole collar and create a whole collar pattern. I don't work in half patterns for pieces that are narrow against the fold, because if you place them on your fabric at slightly the wrong angle, you get a different result. So I'm going to do the same with the stand. I know that there's only the edge where the collar and the collar stand meet, that I know that that's the only edge that I can judge. Holding up to the light, seeing the pencil line through where they connect, and then folding. So I have the centre position of both pattern pieces. And it was just very slightly different to how it appeared on the collar itself, which is fine. So I'm now going to check to see if my pattern pieces match each other. And there's a very slight difference. Yeah, of about 2 millimeters, but I won't know which pattern piece needs to be adjusted, whether this original position should have been the centre back and this collar wants to be slightly bigger, or the collar stand itself needs to be slightly smaller. They are both finishing following the correct line, so I know that it's not the angles. So I'll find out that information when I'm fitting it into the neck of the jacket, and that will tell me whether my collar is going to be one measurement or the other. Okay, I'm going to now check to see if my collar fits into my neck correctly. So I'm going to be laying seam on seam line to check. So I'm doing the back neck first, and I will mark where the shoulder seam matches, and then lining up to the front to see if that matches the corner for the collar start position at the front, and it does. You will see that the angles are slightly different. The edge that the collar is going to be pushed into is straighter. This has got more of an angle because we're going to be pushing to create some lift. So that's correct. We shouldn't match and it be completely flat. We should have the angle. So now we check to see if our two collars now match correctly. So I'm starting at the centre back of the collar and I'm rolling it round to that position to where it would finish, and I've got to make sure that this is a straight line. I don't want any bumps. So I can see there's a little bit of a dip, so I'm drawing that line in because this part of the collar needs to be straight. I need to be able to have a continuous line. You can see that that's made this area extend a little, but as long as the two match, we don't have a problem. So I'm now checking to see if my collars stand. And then my upper collar fit into the area, and we are there. It's about 1 millimetre different, so I'm going to go with the collar that I've got. I'm going to allow that to move over a millimetre. It may be that my stand's 1 millimetre too big, I don't know. But when we're copying a reference sample, we just need to just get as close as we can. We're then going to toile it and do any adjustments that we want to make the garment our own. So I'm going to tidy up the seams, making sure the back neck is at right angles. Now, for industry patterns, we would be adding 0.7 of a centimetre to the edges that would be bagged out, and 1 centimetre to where the collar would connect into the neck. We would also only be adding 0.7 through where the collar stand and the collar itself match. But for university work, we do 1 centimetre everywhere to make it less complicated for you. So the collar's now ready for its seam allowance, and we can move on to checking to see if the sleeve fits the armhole. Okay, we're now going to check that our sleeve fits our armhole. So we've got a few positions that we gave ourselves. We know that the shoulder will be approximately in this area. And when looking at our jacket, we can see that the front seam of the sleeve and the front side body seam match. So that will be our starting position, because there's not usually any easing around that area, so we should get a true measurement. So I'm going to start with my front sleeve, and again I'm working seam line on top of seam line. I'm matching them up in the corner, and then I'm working around seam line on top of seam line. And the shoulder line finishes in this position. And I'll put a little marker on the end so that I know what that line is. So I can start my undersleeve starting from the side panel where it joined the front body. We can see that I have a little row of dots here where on my garment it met the end of this pattern piece. So we can check to see how accurate we are. So I'm going around the armhole, and we can see that our pattern piece finishes about 1 to 2 millimeters away from that position. So that's pretty good, considering we're working on a thick garment. So I'm quite happy with that. So now I'm taking the point where our pattern pieces ended and joining that to the next piece and working seam line on top of seam line. Then making a marker for where that part of the sleeve. The back seam ends on the undersleeve, and then I will join the back sleeve of the top sleeve to that marker and work around the rest of the head, seam line on top of seam line. Just double check that I slipped. And we have a marker there. So, our sleeve is the distance between these two markers bigger than our armhole. So this is our ease. So that's 2.5 centimetres, which is fine for a tailored jacket. Tailored jackets in general are 2 to 3 centimetres ease. They're sometimes a little less if you're trying to make a very slim sleeve. So I'm going to make a marker in the centre, and that's where my shoulder notch will be. So that's the head of my sleeve. You can see from where we marked it off the original garment, I did say it would change because all of the easing was over to one side, which you can see it is. And so I now have a central position. So I'm going to pop in a few other notches for my armhole to make sure that it's nice and easy to sew. It's good to have a double notch towards the back of the armhole so that you can always make sure that you're travelling in the right direction. And the ease in the head would be at the upper part of the sleeve. So I would generally want to be in the upper area. The connection seam for this sleeve is quite high up. But I'm going to only do my easing starting from above that line. So I'm just folding on my seam line so that I can see where that would be. And my easing would start from there and towards the front of the sleeve at about the same position towards the top of the head, and mark that onto and I will also put another notch lower down to indicate that it's towards the front of the arm. I'm just going to go over the notches with a highlighter so that they don't get confused with any other markings. So we now know that our sleeve fits our armhole. We have notches towards the underarm, towards the front, and I'm going to put some in at the back as well so that panels can never be stitching the wrong way around. I'm going to bring in another notch to the mid-side seam. to give a balanced position. And I do a triple notch down the centre back. So notches need to go into your pattern in the very early stages so that you can be sure that you're sewing your toile together correctly, and that if you do have any problems, you can identify exactly which area of the garment your problems are in. So this pattern's now ready for you to put hems and seam allowance on and make up your first toile.